Hi, it's Shan Wu with a Under Color of Law analysis of a little bit overdue, my thoughts on legal structure and the election, but I thought it was a good time since many of you will be visiting with relatives for Thanksgiving, and this can give you a lot of fuel and ammunition for healthy, peaceful discussion. So I want to focus this discussion on Senator Chris Murphy, who a little bit after the election put out a pretty long, substantive 10-tweet thread. And he sort of has a prescription for what we need to do in the future, diagnosis of what's gone wrong. And it's a good jumping off point because I really feel like there is an intersection here of legal structure issues, legal issues, as well as the politics of what's happened with the election. So he starts by saying it's a cataclysm, it's the electoral map wipeout. He was tweeting early, he probably had some emotional reactions to it. Time has told that the numbers aren't quite like that. But he says, it's time to rebuild the left. He says, we're out of touch with the crisis of meaning and purpose, feeling MAGA, we refuse to fight big fights, our tent is too small. Here are some of his thoughts in the Twitter thread, which we'll put up, and there's a link, you can look at it. So first he says, the left has never fully grappled with the wreckage of 50 years of neoliberalism, which has left legions of Americans adrift as local places are hollowed out, rapacious profit-seeking cannibalizes the common good, and unchecked new technology separates and isolates us. Now, first let me say, I'm going to generally agree with his principles here. I mean, the senator's in the right place. But the analysis I really don't agree with. So there's this overall notion that the Trump regime and MAGA has appealed to kind of plain folks, working class folks, and that's wrong, right? Because really there are plenty of us who are plain folks, working class folks. One of the things that's wrong is a phrase like 50 years of neoliberalism. What the heck is neoliberalism? I mean, I can look it up, so can you. It tends to be a market theory, but talking in words like that right away indicates what some of the out of touch issues are, and yet he's trying to make the point of, the left is out of touch. That's tweet number 2 for him in the thread. He says, the things that matter are disappearing. We spend half as much time with friends as a generation ago. Hard work no longer guarantees economic mobility. Institutions like churches are delegitimized. Place-based identity evaporates as we all become global citizens. Okay, there's a lot wrong with that, okay? I don't know about the spending half as much time with friends as a generation ago. Obviously, a generation ago, they did not have video chats, they didn't have text messaging, they didn't have cell phones. If you only treat physical time, that might be true. Arguably, we may spend a whole lot more time. Technology has changed. That's a fact. And in fact, one of the problems, I think, for the Democrats is you have to figure out what that means in terms of how people absorb information, this technological change. Hard work no longer guarantees economic mobility. It never did. There are lots of things, misogyny, sexism, all sorts of things held people back no matter how hard they worked. So that's like a misnomer there. Institutions are delegitimized. Well, they're delegitimized like the Supreme Court for a real good reason, that people are beginning to see through what the problems are. Place-based identity evaporates as we all become global citizens. Again, I'm not really sure what he means by that. It kind of sounds like it's an attempt to make some inroads in on the Trump message, make America first, trying to say, hey, I'm a liberal Democrat, we are liberal Democrats, but we still adhere to these old-fashioned values. A lot of those old-fashioned values are illusions because there is so much injustice that happened with the institutions. The values aren't illusions, but the idea that everything was perfectly fulfilled and working, that's the illusion. His next point in the thread, he says the left skips past the way people are feeling, alone, impotent, overwhelmed, and straight to uninspiring solutions, more roads, bulk drug purchasing, that do little to actually upset the status quo of who has power and who doesn't. Again, people need roads, those, quote, uninspiring solutions. That's a conclusory messaging point. You have to help drug purchasing. You have to have good infrastructure. Without that, people's lives will be really poor. You have to explain that better, maybe. I mean, you got to sell your programs, make sure you publicize what's actually been done. But the idea that the left is only paying attention to uninspiring solutions, maybe some MAGA diehards are really inspired by what Trump says, But there's no substance to what he's talking about. It's just a bunch of hot air. That's what they bought into. So the fact that Democrats, and I'll talk about this in a second, ever since LBJ's Great Society, have done things substantively, that does not mean they're uninspiring. The word uninspiring is more a question of how you're promoting it, how you're communicating it to people. Now, my favorite in his thread here, number 5, does racism explain part of the attraction of the right's nativism? Of course. But mass deportation isn't. Now, this is the problem, right? It's the but and the of course. When he talks about the left being afraid to take on big fights, this is kind of exactly an example of that big fight. Racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, it's an enormous part of the attraction to the right. But many progressive liberals or establishment liberals are afraid to talk about that. They're afraid to talk about the history of what's happened and how it's being reflected now. Don't be afraid to talk about that. That is a huge part of the attraction. What do you do about it? That's a different question. Then he talks about we don't listen well enough. We tell people what's good for them. Okay, I mean, you can't be afraid to confront people. That's not telling people what's good for you. It's telling people what's wrong with racism, the way that people are thinking, the way that they're buying into falsehoods about what Trump has said. Then he addresses men. He says men are tumbling into a different kind of identity crisis, patriarchy. The right pushes an alluring dial back. The left says, get over it. A refusal to listen, to offer responsible solutions. It's not a responsible solution just to accept that there's some unknown silent majority of men who are voting because they want to go back to the 1600s. I'm exaggerating. I mean, it's kind of like Nixon's silent majority. I think that is a misunderstanding of what's happening, and that has a lot to do with culture and media, which is something we do need to pay a lot of attention to. He talks about we can't be afraid of fights. The right regularly picks fights with elites, Hollywood, Democrats, Harris campaign. Don't fight hard enough with billionaires and corporations. You know, that I would agree with. So that's fine. We should fight and not be afraid of sounding like we're alienating people when we fight. Number 9, he says real economic populism should be our tent pole. Here's the thing, then you need to let people into the tent who aren't 100% on board with us on every social and cultural issue, or issues like guns or climate. Again, that seems like an attempt to sort of chip away at this perception of who is the MAGA right. If you actually improve the economy of the country, which is exactly what the Biden administration did, it's a roaring good economy now, just ask economists, then you are including everybody. It doesn't matter whether they agree with you on social and cultural issues. So that doesn't matter. If those people are helped, they are helped. That's the thing to keep in mind here. So what's funny is I put up a screenshot of the 2 first replies to him from 2 big accounts. And again, given the benefit of the doubt, this was kind of early in his reaction to the election, but basically they're saying, hey, dude, relax, we lost by 2 points. It's not the big message you're trying to make. And of course, he's trying to put together a message for going forward. Midterms are coming up. How are you going to run against this sort of MAGA regime, this MAGA mindset? But let me suggest that isn't the way to think about it. The legal system and our structure failed. I mean, certainly failed as far as the Trump trials go, the federal ones, and I've talked about that. There's too much emphasis, and I think this is the real prescription for society going forward and politics. There's too much emphasis on the identities of who is leading, and that misses the point. There's been some criticism of points I put out that said, hey, the Trump trials, prosecutions being dismissed, it's a stress test of the system that failed. And people say in replies, wasn't that the system failed, we had lousy leaders. Garland sucks, the Supreme Court sucks, they're corrupt. Okay, I may agree with some of those sentiments, but that misses the point about the system failing its stress test, because it's not really based on individuals. That's a mistake to think about that, because it's really just pushing the exceptionalism idea that when you have the right leader, the great leader, everything works right. No, you need systems that kind of protect you from those extremes. Too much of what Trump is throwing away right now, he's able to throw away on the transition, for example, no background checks, because there is nothing set in that system. It's dependent upon people agreeing to go along with that, people wanting to take the $7 million that Trump's giving up for the transition because he has billions available to him from other people like Elon Musk. If you made that part of the structure, that's something we can learn from with this failure. If you made part of the structure that presidents can be charged, nothing wrong with a sitting president being charged. Supreme Court has said they have immunity. Okay, that's got to be changed someday. But the Justice Department rules, where the Office of Legal Counsel said you can't prosecute a sitting president, that's not law. That can be changed. Those are structural things that can be changed. But most importantly, we have to quit assuming or believing that it's exceptional people that have to lead the system. Look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, white Southern Democrat, who masterfully pushed through the civil rights legislation, which gives us much of the safety net and basic idea of protections for today. It's not that before he became president, he was such an exceptional, heroic leader of civil rights, but he was a good politician. He used the time to make structural changes. Race, gender identities, they don't guarantee a thing. Obviously, look at Tim Scott or Nikki Haley. Look at the generations of liberals who failed to do anything, white males. We need to get away from this idea of exceptionalism, which is usually thought of, American exceptionalism. We buy into that. Quit making the Supreme Court rock stars. Look at other countries that have dozens of justices. Nobody even knows who they are. That's a structural change. Those are the things we need to be thinking about. Most important on structural change is how we take in information and who we look to for that. We need to move away from mainstream media. That doesn't mean ignore it, but channels like this one, all sorts of different ways of receiving and interacting with information that get criticized as being siloed. No, it's not a silo when there's an infinite amount of channels that you can look at, infinite ways to interact with each other. And that's what we have to do. We have to interact with each other, have dialogue, do our own analysis, and test the analysis. Test my analysis. Let me know if you disagree with something. I'm happy to listen. All right, so with that, hopefully you're having a good holiday. Talk to you later.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.